The Only One, written by Evelyn Chavez. Epilogue. An overall mist of extreme fear overcame the group. The thick fog enveloped them. No one could truly escape the sensation of utter fear. It poured into the face and flowed throughout the body. It found its way into the bloodstream and made everything run black. They felt their hearts pumping everywhere except where their hearts should be. The fog found its way to the stomach where it caved into itself and became a black hole, forever consuming, becoming heavier and heavier to where it weighed down the group more than their packs ever could. They gasped for breath, any kind of breath, that didn't make their lungs ache and their hearts sting. Breathing made their throats dry and made their lips crack. Breathing made it difficult to stay alive. Someone's breath hitched. Someone else's breathing became so desperate it sounded like they were drowning and far away from any kind of land, far away from any kind of safety. Desperation filled their lungs and anxiety filled their bloodstream. The sound of their feet pounding on the ground shook the forest, and it felt like each hard stomp cracked the earth to expose its core. They had been running for a long time, but now they were in peril. If they stopped, it meant death. The forest they were in passed by in a blurry picture of dark green and mossy brown. Twigs snapping and leaves crunching were exaggerated into monsters, and the darkness from trees covering the sunlight made it seem like they were running through a nightmare. A man ahead of everyone else managed to notice a gap in between the tightly wound up wall of trees and made the motion to the people behind him to follow. Their leader had found yet another escape. He pointed towards the opening and quickly counted off everyone in the group, making sure they didn't trip over the roots. He waited until everyone passed through and then scouted the area for a large rock. As he exited, he closed off the exit out of the dark forest. Everyone was breathing hard. The sudden change in brightness left them squinting and vulnerable. They all desperately tried to adjust their eyes before they were blindsided and picked off one by one. Children rubbed their eyes and others covered the sun with their hands. Some of them began to notice the warmth of the afternoon and slowly began to embrace the small moment of peace. They blinked away the immense light and began to take in their surroundings. They had emerged in a pasture, a beautiful sea of green that moved in waves with the wind. The waves rolled in soft movements, and instead of crashing, they dispelled any sense of fear by swaying into nothingness. Where the waves disappeared, land appeared. In this green sea there lay a white church. It sang a song of tranquility and enchanted them to come inside. It seemed like angels were singing them to their safety, to be at rest forevermore. The group sprinted towards the opening of the church and automatically began their procedures. A small group of experienced fighters broke off from the larger group and began checking the perimeter of the building with guns strapped to their backs. You could hear the pitter-patter of their feet as they walked out of view and out of existence. The larger group began making their way into the church. They positioned themselves so stronger members surrounded the weaker. They noticed that the doors were chained shut. Someone from inside the circle came out and grabbed the bolt cutters from inside their pack. Another member with more strength grabbed them and adjusted the cutters. With minimum force, the old chains broke apart. The cutters and the members were returned to their original positions. They opened the doors, ready as they could be. With weapons raised, they entered, but no dangerous creatures were found. The group began to scope out the area. Inside the church were the usual line of pews, an altar, a pulpit, and a tortured Jesus Christ nailed to a cross raised above everything else. Wind from an open window blew the white curtains that had been hung on either side of the front and back ends of the church. They swayed in the wind like ghosts, and they draped so elegantly that it added a feeling of sophistication to the small, modest church. One of the younger boys went up to the curtains and cleaned off his dirty hands. One older woman from the inner circle ran her pointer finger along one of the pews and then rubbed it onto her thumb. A thick clump of dust fell from between her fingers, and she let out a small sigh. On each corner of the church stood a statue. Several members walked around and noticed small plaques that were underneath the four statues. At the back of the church stood St. Paulinus of Nola holding a small bell and St. Rita of Cassia holding a skull. At the front of the church on either side of the cross stood St. Judas Thaddeus holding a medallion with the image of Jesus on it, and St. Padre Pio holding his skull out towards the church with a quote, "God will never permit anything to happen to us that is not for our greater good." By far the most prominent and beautiful part of the church were the windows. Colored glass and fragments fused together to create masterpieces. There were 6 windows on each side of the longer stretches of the church. 12 windows for the 12 disciples. They were standing on top of clouds, and they all had tongues of fire emanating from their heads. The colors of the rainbow surrounded their bodies in separated segments, and with the sun shining through, the colors broke off and lay shattered on the floor and the pews. The dust that had been blown off the doors danced around in the light. Everything looked like a dream, like heaven itself. Once it seemed safe, they all let out a breath they didn't know they were holding. They broke up their circle, and while some were sitting in the pews, others went around to look more closely at the statues or the windows. A young woman walked around with her inhaler, attempting to maintain a steady breath amongst the elders and tending to old wounds. A man with one eye comforted the smaller boy who had cleaned his hands off. A few people were praying in the pews, while others were reading from the Bible. A tiny girl had put her pink backpack down and had laid her head on a Bible. A single tear ran down her dirty face and dropped onto the red carpet. Silence filled the room. Their leader let out a sigh. Gunshots erupted. Shouts and screams were heard calling for mercy. A loud crack followed a scream. Blood splattered on one of the glass windows. Hearts stopped. Others couldn't stop. Chaos is attempting to enter. No one knew what to do. Everyone froze with wide eyes. An object smacked against the back wall that held the cross. The plaster began to crack. It jerked the people awake, and then they formed their circle with unease and shakiness. The young boy began to cry out loud, and a frail man began to pray under his breath. A massive tentacle broke through the entire back half of the church. The dust flew up, and broken pieces of the wall were scattered everywhere. The sickening feeling of fear came back, and it hit everyone like a brick wall. They felt an overwhelming presence of something not really alive. Instead of just living, it consumed the air and space it preoccupied, and it gave off waves of anxiety. A giant dark pile of rotting sludge rose to its full height to peer into the church. Its body towered over the building and blocked the sun. Everyone trembled and stood horrified at the looming mass of darkness. The beast had found them. A slim, sluggish tentacle broke through the blood-shattered window and grabbed a woman from the inside. Without even being touched, you could feel its boiling and chilling slime. The woman began to wail in desperation, and she attempted to pound her fists. But once she touched the sludge, her skin began to deteriorate and peel off. Blisters the size of softballs formed on her arms and burst, exploding in darkened blood and cooked meat. You couldn't see from the ground, but she began to tremble. The oozing beast thrusted her downwards amongst a small pile of rotting flesh and bones outside. Her hair fell in clumps from either side of her, and the smell of the dying made the little girl throw up. Another slim tentacle came out of the sides of the beast and attempted to grab one of the children. Their leader began shooting at the tentacle heading towards them, and the beast howled and retracted. More shots were heard, but from farther away. Pockets of sludge exploded from the back of the beast's head. Those holding guns had a rush of nerves and began to shoot at the beast. With each shot, more pockets of sludge expelled. One of the larger pockets fell onto someone's face, and they let out a muffled scream as they attempted to rip off the slime, only destroying their hands in the process. They fell backward, and 2 tentacles grabbed the young boy. A tentacle held either side of the boy and ripped him in half from his stomach. His organs exploded out. The beast dropped the boy, and the child lay twitching on the floor as he gasped and tried to put his insides back inside of his severed body. He began to whimper as his eyes grew wide before he stopped altogether. There was no point. There was never a chance. The leader yelled at the few remaining members to hide or run as far away as possible. A tentacle lunged at him, and he dropped to the ground before it rammed against the side of the wall and broke the windows. The leader began rolling underneath two of the pews before stopping and grabbing the little girl with the backpack. He ran to the other side of the church and ducked underneath the partially damaged pulpit, passing decaying bodies and the old man who had decided to sacrifice his few years left to distract the beast from those who went to hide. The leader took off the girl's backpack and put it on himself. He held a finger to his lips and tried to grab some of the rubble to hide her. He heard a solid thud behind him, and before he could react, the little girl ran out past him. He whipped around to see the girl's mother on the floor. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and held a hand out to her daughter to stay behind him. A pocket of sludge had landed on her pregnant stomach. She lay dying right in front of their eyes. The little girl began to cry silently, and she kissed her mother before a tentacle grabbed her skinny leg and she disappeared from the leader's sight, without even a tiny scream. The mother's eyes lost their spirit soon after. The leader began to hyperventilate, and he held his chest to try to calm himself down. The narrow space underneath the pulpit felt like it could cave in at any second, and the screams began to echo inside his head. Everything that could be worth living for had died right before his eyes. There was nothing he could do, and as far as he knew, everyone was gone. He was the only one. He was alone. His heartbeat had begun to slow, and he was about to make his way outside to face the beast one last time before the beast smacked the side of the wall he was near, making him jump and hit something small underneath the pulpit. He hissed in pain and held the back of his head as warm blood began to trickle down his neck. Seconds passed. A church bell began to ring. A large bronze bell hung boldly on top of a tower at the front end of the church, the side the beast had not destroyed. It had a thunderous sound that echoed for miles, calling for something to happen. It banged and sent vibrations into the beast's body. Every piece of the beast that had come off began to ripple and vibrate wildly from the sounds, shrinking in size. The beast began to screech and let out a blood-curdling scream as its entire body began to shake uncontrollably. The man grinded his teeth as his head began to throb from the screams and the sounds from the bell. The beast flailed its limbs and it struggled to hold itself up. The vibrations made it hard for the beast to sense anything. It searched for the waves coming off of the last human, but the bell chimed loudly and it couldn't find the human's exact spot. It found something underneath the rubble and slammed it against the ground before inserting it into its own body. The sludge quickly sucked in the remains, and the beast rolled off as far as possible. The bell finished its last remaining chimes, and the waves of fear left the air. There were 12 chimes for 12 o'clock. The man, still holding onto the back of his head, but now with a piece of his shirt, came out from underneath the pulpit. He surveyed the remains of everything. Decaying bodies were scattered across the ground, and he even caught a glimpse of a few limbs in the nearby trees before diverting his attention. A few remaining rocks and bricks that had lost support were falling from the giant pile of rubble. The cross still lay underneath the broken wall, but with nobody attached to it. A majority of the pews had been broken or were beginning to decompose from the acidity of the sludge. Only one curtain blew in the wind. The little boy's hands were still stained onto its fabric, but it now had splattered blood surrounding it. All of the statues had fallen, or were only partially there. Colorful glass lay shattered on the pews and the carpet. Everything smelled of blood. The man searched for a specific body and found him underneath a thrown pew near one of the headless statues. The pack on top of the body lay untouched, so he took out a bandage and some alcohol for his head. He winced in pain as he bandaged himself and looked down at his friend. He dropped the items on the pew and fell to his knees near his friend's body to listen for breathing. Nothing, of course. He knelt there, with the sun completely overhead and the air holding a grotesque stench. "Johnny, when I die, I'm going to kick your ass for leaving me alone out here." The man picked himself up and didn't bother to wipe his tears. He carefully took the backpack off of his friend's shoulders and dropped it onto the pew with the other stuff. He sighed heavily before going around and picking up other useful things people had held onto. He took tiny backpacks off of kids, knives from severed legs, and guns still strapped to torsos. He walked slowly, practically dragging himself throughout the church and pasture, only occasionally stopping for the bell to stop ringing, his head throbbing in pain with each echoing call. After grabbing the items, he would move the body out into the pasture. He pushed rubble off of people and found a giant stick to knock down bodies from trees. He struggled to take the pew off of Johnny, but he eventually dragged him out into the pasture with everyone else before collapsing alongside him. He looked over at the girl and her mother laying side by side, the married couple underneath the shade of a tree, and everyone else laid out holding hands, all except for one woman, whose arms he never found. He lay down on the ground amongst them, and he looked up at the fading colors of the sky. He closed his eyes as the chimes went out into the air. It was past 6 o'clock when he fell asleep out in the pasture.